This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Mr. Jensen Beach, presenting his new book, Swallowed by the Cold. Mr. Beach teaches in the BFA program at Johnson State College. He's the author of the collection For Out of the Heart Proceed, and his work has appeared in A Public Space, The New Yorker, Ninth Letter, Tin House, and elsewhere. In this book, he brings us a collection of intricate, interlocking stories set in a Swedish village on the Baltic Sea, as well as in Stockholm, over the course of 2 eventful years. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Jensen Beach.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? All of you? Right here. Thanks so much for having me. It's a wonderful space. I love being here. It's nice to see some people in Miami. This is only my second time in Florida, and it's been just a wonderful experience so far. I'm going to read a pretty short story. It's called The Apartment. It was in the New Yorker last summer. Louise knew someone had moved in by the new name on the call box. She'd seen lights and movement in the apartment, which was across the courtyard from her and Martin for the past few days. The new name confirmed it. Someone had finally bought the place. The name had been typed onto a small green piece of paper and taped to the call box beside the apartment's number. She'd known a man with the name Jahani at school. Armand had been a doctoral student in French the year she started at Stockholm University. He'd taught the conversation tutorial she took fall term. She looked at the green paper again. All that was so long ago. He was the second man she'd ever slept with. Martin still didn't know about it. She checked her watch. She was on her way out to meet her son Jonas for lunch. The metro she wanted to take was due in 10 minutes. Armand had come from Iran to study, or maybe he'd come to escape the revolution. She couldn't recall the details now. The years fell into one another. A bus rushed past on the street, and the blast of warm air stung her neck. Jonas wanted to try a sushi restaurant he'd heard about. They took a table on the patio. It was September, but very warm out. She let him order. Armand had died in the early 90s. He was a professor of French at the university by then, and his death had been noted briefly in the culture section of DN. One of his books about French cognates had caused a minor controversy. She remembered it well. His obituary mentioned 2 children, a daughter and a son. Maybe one of them had moved into her building. News from home, she said, after the waitress had brought their drinks. Water for Jonas, white wine for Louise. Jonas hadn't lived with Louise and Martin for more than a decade, but still she thought of the apartment as his home. The apartment across the courtyard finally sold. The neighbor who died, he said. Dad mentioned it. Martin served on the co-op board and would have known about the sale. He rarely shared such information with Louise. That's right, she said. Barbara Ekman. Her children had been trying to sell the place for months. You can't imagine the smell when the body was first discovered. The apartment, which was 1 floor lower than her and Martin's, had been empty since Barbara Ekman died before Christmas the previous year. Her body was found only after Martin, who'd been up in the attic storage area on that side of the building to retrieve a box of decorations, smelled the decomposition. The air was sour and rotten, even 2 floors up. He'd been upset, Louise remembered, that no one in the building had noticed for so long, that no one who lived closer to Barbara Ekman had been alarmed by the overwhelming stench of her rotting body. They're all so selfish, he'd said. But Louise suspected he was really only upset that he'd been the one to make the discovery. Jonas took a drink of his water. Gruesome, he said. It had been snowing the day the cleaning company came. She watched from her kitchen as they worked. They scrubbed walls and floors, removed furniture. They even took some of the fixtures and appliances from the kitchen. The idea that humans are so unclean on the inside preoccupied Louise for weeks. Well, she told her son, I can't imagine what a relief it must be to her family. I don't think I ever met that woman, said Jonas. Not that I remember. She was very old, Louise said. She couldn't tell if he was telling the truth or only saying this to annoy her. From the bedroom on the courtyard side of their apartment, there was a clear view of Barbara Ekman's living room. When Jonas was young, that bedroom had been his. Now Martin used it as an office. She rarely went in the room anymore. Martin was private about so much. Do you remember the blue light from her window? She asked Jonas, how it used to reflect on the flower box. I think so, he said. It used to scare you, she said. He tore open the paper wrapping of the chopsticks, pulled them apart, and rubbed them together to smooth the edges. It was so easy to explain, she said. It's just her television, I always told you, but you never believed me. The waitress arrived with 2 rectangular plates and set them down in the center of the table. Colorful pieces of fish were arranged on each plate. She'd tried to listen to what Jonas had ordered and follow along in her own menu, and she'd easily been able to do so, but now that the food had arrived, she couldn't tell one piece of fish from another. Jonas pointed with his chopsticks. Salmon, he said, and yellowtail, whitefish, eel on this plate here. She'd always disliked eel. Eel could travel great distances out of the water, and she found this disturbing. Who bought the apartment? Jonas asked. I only know a name, Louise said. Armand had been a good teacher. She could still recite the conjugation of several French verbs, hear his voice reading from lists he'd put on the chalkboard, present indicative, present conditional, present subjunctive. She remembered the strangest things. There couldn't be that many Johannis in Stockholm. Jonas was 34. Would she feel jealous or relieved if the person in the apartment was close to that age? She watched her son eat. He talked about a problem at his office. An email had been accidentally sent to the wrong person, and Jonas found this uncomfortably funny. He'd only been in his current position for a year, and everything he said about his job, positive or negative, surged with fresh excitement. When they finished, Jonas insisted on paying the check. As he was figuring out the tip, she typed an email to herself on her phone with a reminder to deposit money in his account. She walked him back to work. They said goodbye to each other outside the glass-walled entryway of the building's lobby. Jonas vanished into the crowd of office workers. It was remarkable how similar to her son they all looked. It had been the same when he was in school. They were all identical. Hundreds of them crowded the spaces of his childhood, his soccer matches, ski lessons, piano. She'd always been at ease with being the mother of a child who was like everyone else. It had been a relief to exist so close to the middle. She'd believed this all her life. There were so many fewer risks. She watched the crowd fill the lobby. These could all be my children, she thought. She decided to walk home. Systembolaget had a location near Jonas's office, and she wanted to buy a bottle of wine. It embarrassed her to buy wine more than twice a week from the same Systembolaget, and she'd been to the location closer to her apartment only the day before. Lately, she'd been interested in South African wines. She picked 2 bottles of a Cabernet that, according to a sign fastened to the shelf in the store, had ranked very highly in a blind taste test. She paid for the wine, and as she left the store, she looked up and down the street to see if there was anyone who might recognize her. Then she stuffed the bottles into her purse, concealing what wouldn't fit all the way in with her scarf, and walked the rest of the way home. The green piece of paper was still there on the call box, partly obscuring the name Ekman. On one corner of the paper, curled outward in the heat. With her fingernail, she started to peel the tape up so that she could reposition it over the paper, but she stopped herself. The stairwell was dark. Someone in an apartment on the ground floor was playing music very loudly. The volume faded as she climbed the stairs. By the second floor, she could no longer recognize the song. She set her purse on the kitchen counter. The bottles clinked. Her purse muffled the sound. It was 2, according to the oven clock. Martin was at work. That evening, he was going out with colleagues to celebrate his retirement. They were taking him to a karaoke bar. She didn't expect him to be home until late. Martin was retiring early. They didn't need the money, and he was bored with work. She opened one of the bottles of wine and poured herself a glass. Sometimes she worried she was damaging her health. The music was still playing, and it seeped clearly into the kitchen. She took her wine to the balcony and sat looking out over the courtyard. The curtains in Barbara Ekman's apartment were drawn, and the apartment was dark. A new song came on, one she recognized. She mouthed along to a few words of the chorus, took a sip of her wine. The wine tasted good, and the song reminded her of someplace nice. She couldn't place the memory exactly, but the song made her think of the outdoors, of a beautiful view. There were trees and snow. Maybe the song had been on the radio frequently during a trip they'd once taken. The stairwell light flickered. a book to read. "Who's watching him?" she asked. "Has Johanna come back?" The bed was warm and comfortable, and Martin's silhouette in the doorway appeared much larger than he actually was. "I need to find my book," he said. "They have books there," she said, "and a television." "I'm tired, Louise," he said. The shadow of her husband stepped out of the doorway and disappeared into the hall. She heard a door open and close, then another, then the airy creak of leather as he settled himself down into his chair in the living room. She got out of bed and wrapped herself in her robe. It had happened many times since, but this was the first time she could remember hating her husband. Over the years, that became such a familiar, even comfortable feeling. It was cold out, and she crossed the courtyard as quickly as she could. She was careful to avoid an icy patch where the shadow from a first-floor balcony kept the ground wet, even in the warmest part of the day. Before she'd reached the door to the other building, a gust of wind blew, and she felt the chill on her bare legs. She could remember so much about that evening, but not what the problem with the boy had been. She couldn't recall Johanna coming home, but she remembered distinctly waking up on Johanna's couch, her throat and stomach on fire with heartburn and hatred for Martin. The next time she saw Johanna, she'd ask about that night. We inhabit memories so differently from one another. Or better, our individual memories of a shared event mean such different things to each of us. It had something to do with identity, she supposed, but she didn't feel like chasing after the thought any further. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the balcony or else on the narrow, soft couch in the living room reading. Days passed quickly when she drank. By 5 o'clock, the sun had dipped behind the building to the west and the temperature dropped. Louise had nearly finished the first bottle of wine. When her neighbors started to arrive home after the workday, she went inside and sat at the kitchen island. She was careful about appearances. Sometimes she threw away bottles instead of taking them to the recycling because she didn't want her neighbors to see how much she drank. She fixed herself something to eat and opened the second bottle of wine. She watched the news while she ate. Dusk settled over the courtyard, and by 8 it was dark. She shut the television off and took a thin blanket from the couch and returned to the balcony. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. Outside the apartment, she could smell her own inside life distinctly on the blanket. The courtyard was dark. She tried to find a pattern in the lit-up windows on the building opposite. 2 dark, 1 light, 3 light, 1 dark, 3 light. Windows lit up and darkened, and she could never get past a third position in the pattern, and soon gave up trying and enjoyed the evening. Occasionally, the building's front door would open loudly and slam shut. The hall light switched on and then off with every neighbor who came home or left. She heard voices, a television, laughter. Barbara Ekman's apartment was still dark. She was the one who'd ended things with Armand. She'd gotten pregnant, and the idea that the baby might be his had frightened her. Of course, the timing wasn't quite right. The last time she'd slept with Armand was weeks before the likely conception date. She'd been relieved to understand this when the midwife circled the estimated due date on the colorful chart she held in front of Louise and Martin in the cramped exam room at the 13-week checkup. Louise felt as if she'd risked something great and survived. The chances of this happening twice were small. She hadn't told Armand she was pregnant. It was better that he didn't know. Just after the birth, the first time she held Jonas against her chest, she felt the sticky wetness of her own blood on his body. She touched his hair. It was dark, curled wet with blood and amniotic fluid. Until the midwife had washed him and given him back to her, she was terrified that perhaps Jonas was Armand's after all, that she'd miscalculated some crucial fact. The heavy front door of the building creaked open. The light in the front hall came on, sparked out into the courtyard, revealing a chair and the sharp contrasts of shadowed corners. The door slammed shut. She listened to footsteps in the stairwell. Her wine glass was empty, and she got up to fill it. In the warmth of the apartment, she felt a chill in her feet. She filled her glass and held the bottle up in front of her to check how much wine was left, just over half. She took the bottle with her back to the balcony and sat in the darkness. She was warm and didn't need the blanket. The lights in Barbara Ekman's apartment had been turned on. Through the curtains, she saw movement. She watched the windows closely. There were 3, spaced evenly from one end of the building to the other: kitchen, living room, bedroom. There was a bathroom and a small dining room on the other side of the apartment. She knew this because she'd once been inside years before to help Barbara Ekman move a painting from the hall to the bedroom. Barbara Ekman had been dead for 8 months. Louise watched the figure move from window to window, its dark shape heavy in the living room where the light was brightest, faint in the bedroom. Martin wouldn't be home for hours. He never came home when he said he was going to. She couldn't remember how Armand Jahani had died, probably some disease. Most people die in unassuming ways like that, quiet but painful struggles consisting of medicines and doctor visits, hope established, quickly abandoned. It was so boring. Better to die like Barbara Ekman had. By the time Jonas was very young, 2 or 3 perhaps, she'd nearly forgotten that she had once thought he might be Armand's son. She couldn't remember what it had been like to feel any guilt about it. The wine was good, but it had left a sticky film in her mouth, and she didn't want the rest. She got up to find something else to drink. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of scotch from the bottle that Martin saved for special occasions and guests. She didn't like scotch particularly, but this tasted good. It stung her throat. She coughed, took another sip. What would it have been like to raise Armand's son? Without imagining any details, she felt the idea forming, shapely and full, and was able to hold it firmly in her mind for just a moment. What did it matter? Armand was dead. That was the simplest truth of all. Would Martin have figured it out? He'd been a good father, a little distant, a little bit too rooted in his work, perhaps, but that was normal. Jonas had had a good childhood. She was happy she hadn't had to carry a lie as big as his life with her all this time. She emptied her glass, winced, searched the burn of the scotch in her throat for pleasure. On the balcony, she filled the empty glass with the rest of the wine and sat in her chair and drank. In Barbara Ekman's apartment, Armand's real child was alive. It was funny how her path and Armand's, such a ridiculous metaphor, had converged. He would have found it amusing, she was sure of it. The figure came to the window in the kitchen, pulled the curtains to one side, and opened the window. Armand had a daughter. Louise watched her sit at the table, the light from the lamp forming a bright circle at the center of the table. She was drinking something from a mug, coffee or tea, maybe wine, Louise thought. She and Martin had lived in the building longer than anyone but Jan Lindblom down on the ground floor, and Barbara Ekman, of course, before she'd died. Back in the kitchen, Louise poured another finger of whiskey. It tasted a little like wine, but it wasn't bad. In the cupboard, she found an unopened package of cookies, shortbread, the kind Martin liked. The stairwell was dark. She took the first steps carefully, her hand against the smooth wall as a guide. As she descended, the light from the courtyard brightened, and eventually she could walk without fear of falling. Outside, she looked up at her balcony. The light from her kitchen was inviting, soft orange and yellow, warm colors. She would never do this sober. The name on the mail slot on the door was on the mail slot on the door, Jahani. She knocked. Footsteps. The young woman answered. She was beautiful, as far from the middle as Louise's son was near it. "Hello," the young woman said. "I live here," said Louise. "I'm sorry," the young woman said. "I mean, I live in this building," said Louise, "and I wanted to welcome you." "That's very nice," the young woman said. "Thank you so much." She looked back into the apartment. Louise peered in, too. There were open boxes, a leaning stack of blankets and towels, an empty bookcase turned at a funny angle at the end of the hall. I was unpacking. She smiled. Louise could tell she was embarrassed. Louise smiled back and didn't move. "You've just moved in," she said. "Officially tomorrow," the young woman said, getting a head start. "Sarah," she said, and held out her hand. Louise took it. "Louise," she said. It was difficult to recall exactly what Armand had looked like. She might have seen him in Sarah, but had he been tall? Sarah was tall, taller than Louise. He had dark hair, and she remembered him as very thin, but also strong. Sinewy was the word for it. He had thick veins on his arms. "I live just over there," she said. She held the box of cookies out to indicate the direction of her apartment. Sarah looked at her. "Oh, listen to me," Louise said, handing the cookies to Sarah. "These are for you. Welcome." "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said. "Of course," said Louise. "I wanted to. You're one of us now." Sarah smiled. Louise's face and the top of her chest were warm. She touched her fingertips to her throat. "You'll like living here," she said. "I think so too," said Sarah. Louise didn't believe in fate. Every morning she woke up with the thought that that day would be the one something terrible was destined to happen. She did this because she didn't believe it was possible to predict the future, to know what was coming for each of us. Whatever she believed would happen that day, she knew could not, by nature of our inability to predict the future. Lately, she'd been imagining terrible things, car accidents, robberies, disease. Martin thought it was unhealthy and told her so frequently. "This is a good area," she said. "We've been here for years. It's very safe." Sarah fidgeted at the door. "I like this neighborhood. I always have." She held the cookies in front of her, took a step back into her apartment, smiled politely, and put her hand on the door. "You could be my daughter," Louise said. "Excuse me," Sarah said. She let her hand fall from the door. "I could have been your mother. I knew your father before you were born." Sarah squinted a little bit, turned her head slightly to the left. "You've mistaken me for someone else." "Your father and I were friends," said Louise. "We had a relationship." "I think you've mistaken me for someone," Sarah said. Louise reached out and touched Sarah's arm. "It was a long time ago. I was in love with him." Sarah smiled, and in the smile Louise, even drunk, located judgment. This was how Jonas looked at her. Martin, too, the same sad eyes, the narrow, thin-lipped smile. They pitied her, thought she was ridiculous, incapable, unwell. She hated them all. "A woman died here," she said. Sarah started to push the door closed. "Thank you again," she said. "I really should get back to unpacking." "She was very old, the woman who lived here before you," Louise said, stepping forward until she'd nearly entered the apartment. "Her body was found just before Christmas last year. I think she had a stroke." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "I thought you should know," Louise said. "I'd want to know." She put her hand on the door. Sarah looked at her, and Louise saw the pity again. "Are you feeling all right?" Sarah said. "Her name was Barbara," Louise said. She closed her eyes. "The woman who used to live here, she was very old. I think that's the best way to go, don't you, in your sleep, just like that? I don't want to sit around waiting for it." "Can I help you get back home?" Sarah said. "Do you think you'll make it on your own? They've cleaned your apartment. You can't imagine the smell. Martin told me about it. Do you need help walking back?" Louise concentrated on holding her head as still as possible. "No," she said. "It's just over there." In the courtyard, she looked up at Barbara Ekman's apartment. The blinds were drawn. The light in the front room had been turned out. She was cold. She turned the light on in the stairwell, listened to her shoes click and shuffle against the hard stone. From one of the ground floor apartments, loud applause and laughter from a television mocked her. She steadied herself with a hand on the cold wall. She sat at the kitchen island on one of the tall stools, the wobbly one, and finished the food she'd fixed earlier. She ate most of a piece of bread with too much butter and drank more scotch. Armand Jahani did not have a daughter. She was sure of this. It was late and she was tired. Martin would be home soon, and she wanted to be in bed before he arrived. She stood up to pour herself a glass of milk. Milk soothed her stomach. She would be hungover in the morning, but she didn't care. She reached for a glass on the far side of the counter, and as she leaned forward, she brushed the plate off the counter into the floor. Shattered fragments of china tickled her bare feet. The plate was not a plate. It was only dozens of pieces of thick ceramic, the patterned lines and shapes disrupted, taken apart, put back together to form something new. She got down on her knees and moved the largest piece to one side and began to place the smaller pieces on top. The edges were sharp, and she held each piece as tenderly as possible. She knew it was Martin before he even opened the door, and when he entered the room, she didn't need to look up to see that she'd been right. "I've made a mess," she said. She pushed aside the plate and picked up a bit of bread with her fingertips and put the bread in her mouth. "You don't have to do that," Martin said. "Please, I'll get it later." "Forgive me." "I'll help you to bed," Martin said. "You should have stayed, Martin. You could have stayed. It wasn't difficult." She felt his hand on her head. He probably didn't know the night she was talking about, but that didn't matter. She leaned forward, devoted, rapidly filling her mouth with the bread as if she were kneeling at the altar of a darkened church. "Thanks." Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, you guys came. I'd be happy to answer questions. I know. I have a huge audience to draw from. I'm also happy to just mingle in here. Well, I lived in Sweden for 6 years. My wife is Swedish, and 2 of our kids were born there, so I know Sweden really well. And I went to university there. And when I started writing the stories in graduate school, I was specifically interested in writing about Sweden to get to know it a little bit better through a kind of fictional lens, I think. And so as I wrote 1, 2, 3, 4 stories in these sort of the intricate links and interconnections kind of started to reveal themselves, I chased after them. And some of them are very subtle, and some of them are more obvious. But I was. Yeah, we moved back to Massachusetts in 2008, and we've been here since. Yeah. It is. It's a collection of stories, and they're not linked. They're just standalone stories. Many of them are really short, just kind of almost prose poem-like. They were, yeah. They represent mainly stories I wrote before graduate school, and then a little bit in my first year when the book was accepted. And then this book is I started in graduate school and then finished a couple years ago. So yeah, they were there. You're a writer too, right? She outed you. Do you write short stories or novels, or what's your... Nice. Cool. It's my first love too. Yeah. They are. I think they're harder. Although I'm writing this novel right now, and it's like just a slog. It's really terrible. That's true. Yeah. I think that's true. I think a short story often will like not predict, or it teaches you its own shape early on, and you know basically what you need, what to aim for, and then as long as you can fit it within that sort of accordion-like space, you can get the story right. I think so. Yeah. 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 I love that. Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite quotes about writing is from George Saunders. He says that writing and ending well is the art of stopping without sucking. It's great, right? You just know, when it's good. You know when it feels right. Like, yeah, now it's over. Everything that's going to happen in this story, the completed dramatic action has presented itself to me, so now it's... Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, I don't think we should know sometimes, right? Yeah, exactly. It's mystery. That's what's so exciting. Big M mystery, and the mystery of life. Yeah, that's true. Thanks very much. Thank you. I do. Yeah, I teach at a really small school in Vermont called Johnson State College. We have a BFA program, and then I also teach in the MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Both are really, really enriching. Take up a ton of my time, but now my semesters are done, and I get to get back to writing again, which is good. I try to. Unfortunately, I'm not that disciplined in my practice. I have 3 little kids, so they take up a lot of my time, and because my schedule is such, I'm done teaching usually by about 2 every day, with some exceptions. So mainly I take a lot of the child care in the afternoons, and if a kid is sick, I'll stay home because I don't teach every day. My wife has a more traditional 9-to-5 job. So I don't have a ton of time, and I have a... That's not fair. I do have a lot of time that I could use better, but I enjoy spending time with the kids too. So I'd rather be out on the trampoline than in my dark office. So it's not. I can't say that I'm not the kind of writer who's up at 5 o'clock every morning writing for an hour and then going for a jog or something like that. Those people are enviable and frankly a little annoying. No offense if you're one of those guys, but. I'm like, I'll steal a sentence here and there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens actually now that I'm going to be able to give myself more fully to this new project, because previously I do some translation work and then working on revisions and things with this book, and now I'm kind of starting to catch some steam in the novel writing, and so all of this may change. The next time someone asks me that, it might be that, oh yeah, no, I write every day from 3 to 4 in the afternoon, and I have to get in my 1,000 words or whatever. But I've unfortunately never been like that. Are you a disciplined writer? No. Yeah, that's good. I like that when it's pushing on you in that way. Yeah, that's always good. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's true. I like that a lot. Good. I have, and sadly, it was a totally underwhelming experience for me. I went there. We were at my mother-in-law turned 70 5 years ago, and we went to the Club Med in Port St. Lucie. That was the only other time one of the only other times I've been to Florida. And on the way back to Fort Lauderdale, we drove through Jensen Beach. It was going to be this thing, right? That's my name. My name is Jensen Beach. What a coincidence. And we went there. Turns out everything was closed. We found a restaurant, because it was like a Sunday, I think, in May. And went to a restaurant, and the waitress asked me if I was conceived in Jensen Beach. I told her that I wasn't there for that part, but as far as I knew, no, I wasn't conceived in Jensen Beach. And then someone else at the restaurant told me I should be the town mascot. So if the yeah, I hope so. If the municipal authorities in Jensen Beach, Florida are listening, I happily will take up that role for pay, not for free. It is actually my name. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I was born in the 70s, and I got both my grandmother's maiden names, Jensen, and then my middle name is Whalen, after my paternal grandmother. Yeah, well, not too much. Unfortunately, it's sort of a messy, generative kind of thing at this point. But partly it's set in Florida, features a boat and a former actor, and it kind of ranges through time. It's set in the 70s and set today, and as far back as the late 1960s, partly during the Nigerian Civil War. When I summarize the novel, it sounds completely insane, and in my head it's slightly less insane, but it's still it's a big book. The scope of it is kind of probably too big, but at this early stage. In 5 years when I finish and someone asks me what it's about, I might say, oh, it's a domestic drama about a professor in Vermont or something, But for now, it's about all of those things. I don't know. I hope not, but probably. Yeah, I'm a pretty slow writer. I write very... kind of a slog, to be honest with you. Like, I push through sentence by sentence. I don't know how you compose, but I've never been one of those people who can get a whole bunch out and then work with it once it's on the page. I'm more like I wrote 20 words today, and I'm really excited about those 20 words. I'm going to delete them the next day, usually. Hi. How's it going? I'm pretty good. Earlier I read a story. It was fun. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, so if there are no more questions, then a note to our internet audience watching at home that there is still plenty of time for you to call the number on your screen, and we can ship a copy of Swallowed by the Cold to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Jensen will be signing here at the table to the left of the podium. And that was a terrific story. Please give another hand to Mr. Jensen Beach. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jensen.